The final panel is dedicated to the topic of post-colonialism and intercultural relations. We will discuss how we reappropriate or share common cultural heritage with other countries. And the speakers are Tamara Hundorova, a professor, head of Theory of Literature Department, Shevchenko Institute for Literature, National Academy of Science of Ukraine. And online from United States of America with us, Mayhill Fowler, an art historian, associate professor of the Department of History of Stetson University. And she's also directing a program on Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies there. I think there were a lot of mentioning of this topic of, let's say, decolonization of culture in the first panels and in the first keynote speeches in today's forum. And other speakers and participants said something that finally we are speaking about this in different circles and in different contexts, not only in academic sphere, but making it a wider discussion and bringing it to, let's say, public and cultural diplomacy context in this particular case. And we would like to raise this question, first of all, in the relation of intercultural relations that Ukraine is building, and how our post-colonial past affects the image of Ukraine today, and what we can do to change the image and perception of Ukraine by rethinking our past. So, my first question to both of our speakers would be about the the process of rethinking our past in relations to building our new identity. Inside Ukraine, we often speak that our new identity is still being constructed, and despite that there have been 30 years past the collapse of the USSR, we are still considered being post-Soviet state, or we are at least somehow negotiating this naming of ourselves, but it's still it's still being raised. But also we oftentimes relate to the past that none of us have witnessed, but that still affects our present. I'm saying about previous periods, about Russian Empire, let's say, and other empires that Ukraine was divided between, and we're still speaking about this heritage and effect on our today's culture and identity. So in this context, I would like to ask both Tamara and Mayhill, what do you think is different in Ukraine's way of rethinking its colonial past compared to other countries in the region or elsewhere in the world? And what, if there are any particular features that Ukraine has in this process? Pani Tamara, would you like to start?
Yeah, okay. I would like to start with this important disclaimer that basically throughout these times we have seen this change of paradigm when we talk about post-coloniality or coloniality overall, because basically it was quite important for us to discuss the issues of post-colonialism. Of course, we're referring Edward Said in this case. Of course, we're speaking about the overall revitalization of the national states as well. But what we have meant under that, under post-coloniality, we actually stated the end of coloniality, and we can actually have the opportunity to talk about it by actually reviewing some imperial codes, by establishing our ownership. But I think that it's important for us to talk about decolonization right now. This is something that is very relevant for Ukraine right now. It's not about changing of the aesthetical codes or cultural codes. It is an important cultural and political process, the process of different directions at the same time. And we understand that those processes, and it is is very important as well to establish that in our discussion, that decolonization is not a process that goes overnight. It's a long-lasting period. There's a long-lasting period that doesn't actually mean that we solve the issue of coloniality fully. The colonial experience leaves a tremendous legacy in culture, in language, in mentality. Then working on that, rethinking of it, reviewing all of those legacy is a long-lasting process. Basically, in each of those stages, and each of the stages has its own peculiarities. And if we speak about Ukrainian experience of decolonization, and I don't know, let us start it from the period of Ukrainian independence. Let's start it with that approximately. Of course, we should also mention Mykola Khvylev's out from Moscow in 1920s, or we should also mention Mikhail Drahomanov and his theories, who said that we should go to learn Ukrainian and we should not try to take a perspective and look on the international culture through Russian language and Russian culture. But okay, let us consider the last 30 years and let us consider the specifics of colonization in Ukraine. There are a couple of important notions, and I think that all of the researchers have spoken about that. Decolonization of the countries and people who are close neighbors and who have a long-lasting relations in the past, and they seem to be close together, that it is a very hard process. It's a challenging process. And of course, the colonization of Ukraine includes two main processes. It has a double nature. On one hand, it is rethinking of the imperial codes still lasting from those Russian imperial policies, those strategies, something that has turned Ukraine into this colonial south, this beautiful lands, basically there was a fairy tale country that has a tremendously funny, nice people, really nice looking Ukrainian peasant women, nice language. That was that. And the second type of colonization that we've been through was the Soviet period, that also treated Ukrainians as younger brother, that also has been provided this language, additional language that has promoted Russian language about Ukrainian. These peculiarities are important for us to mention. So I do believe that we have to understand that our specifics of the post-colonial issues is that the issues of colonialism are combined with the post-Soviet, post-totalitarian reality in Ukraine, which is a tremendously complex issue. What I was trying to say basically by giving this outline, that I do believe that rethinking the Soviet legacy and Soviet experience is very problematic and challenging for Ukraine. Not just because it's something that separates people in the aspects of cultural memory or cultural identity, but also in a sense that this experience of the Soviet experience, the experience of Sovietization actually, has been something that was a step, a shift to support the empire. It was something that was shifting the models and strategies of existence, and how Ukraine has been colonized culturally, economically, socially. Unfortunately, those schemes have not been analyzed yet for Ukraine.
Much for having me as part of this panel. Can I not hear the translation?
Yeah, we can hear you perfectly. Continue.
Thank you so much. Great. I need to not hear my translation as I'm speaking. Okay, thank you so much. So I think that these questions of decolonization and culture are actually central to Ukraine in the world today. And I think when we talk about decolonizing culture, and very much continuing from what Tamara was saying, we need to think about what culture is, actually. It's a very difficult concept. Raymond Williams in 1983 said it was one of the most complicated concepts in any language. What is it? What is culture? What are we talking about? And I think one very easy way to think about it is worldview. How we see the world, how we understand the world around us. And I think when we talk about post-colonialism and the process of decolonization, one aspect of that is center and periphery. Where is the center? Where is the periphery? And when we think about the world, right, where is our cultural center and where is our cultural periphery? right? And this is so deeply important, I think, particularly coming out of the Soviet experience, because Moscow was so profoundly the cultural center. And so much of the moving away from the colonial period into decolonization is really creating new centers and new peripheries. And I would very much want to bring into the discussion actually a book from very far away, but Dipesh Chakrabarty's Provincializing Europe. And he talks about how for his group of Indian intellectuals, what was so difficult was to take these universal concepts like human rights, natural law, and realize that they were concepts from the empire, right? The empire that colonized them. So how do they take their worldview out of that colonizing process? How do they decolonize their worldview? How do they decolonize concepts? And I think that's where Ukraine is today. How do we create new mental maps, new centers, new comparisons? And essentially, it's about putting yourself at the center of your own story, right? How is Ukraine at the center of its own story? And Tamara gave us a lot of great background about the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. And I would say that what is specific to Ukraine is, in a way, precisely that this is a place that has always been very, very important to other entities, whether it's the Habsburgs or the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth or the Ottoman Empire or the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union or interwar Poland. It has always been a place that is crucial, a place of crossing cultures, as we know, multilinguistic, multi-ethnic, multi-confessional. It is a place that is shaped by many places, and that's unique. That's actually very different from other places and very different from other places coming out of the Soviet experience or the imperial experience, right? That is actually something very specific to Ukraine that makes Ukraine special, that makes it unique, and makes it at the center of its own story. So I think that those sort of rethinking center and periphery and reclaiming centeredness can be an important process of decolonization. And I think I loved how Tamara brought in Mikhail Filevska to the conversation because he was saying away from Moscow. But he was also part of a milieu of people that I wrote about in my book who were building something that was a center. They saw themselves as different from Russia, different from the West, and just as good as everyone else. They were building a center. And I think sort of reclaiming that process of centeredness and owning that centeredness is a process of decolonization in Ukraine today. I have a lot more to say, but I'll stop for now.
Thank you so much. It's an important, actually, putting the most basic idea in at the center of the table. But I would like to go deeper into the process that you just mentioned is being a center, in our own story. I like that phrase, and I think it's super crucial, especially in the context in building or constructing or creating our new identity. Of course, we can say that Ukraine is a new state that has been established 30 years ago, and this is where we begin the new story from. But we all know that the statehood was based in our cultural past, in our cultural history, and we say that we are a new state with ancient culture. And that's where the particular question comes to. How do we reconstruct our past? How do we reconstruct our history? And what are the principles and points where we reappropriate something as part of our cultural heritage and history? Or how do we call it a shared history, something common, something hybrid, something, you name it? Yeah, so how do we actually rebuild our past that actually is has given birth to our today?
I think that is obviously the most important question of how do we evaluate our past and how do we construct our past in a way. Because I do believe that it's not only the question about legacy that we have, but it's also the question of a cultural identity at this point. Because basically, just a couple of days ago, I have seen this post or a message that currently in Moscow, they are holding an exhibition that is called 10 Centuries of Friendship between Moscow and France, between Russia and France. And at this exhibition, there are some artifacts that have been taken from France, that have came from France, and they have presented the gospel that belonged to Anna of Kiev, basically. And this 10 centuries history, it starts of this period when they have this dynasty marriage of Anna, the daughter of Yaroslav, with Henry I. So what is happening with that? What are they doing with that? So, there's not a single mention that she came from Kiev, that she has been the wife, that she has been the wife of Kiev Knyaz before that she has been the daughter, that she has been connected to Kiev Prince's history. So how would they do that? They are actually appropriating our cultural legacy, because Russia claims there are the ancestors of Kiev and Rus. So they are claiming our history and claiming our legacy. So I do believe that basically when we speak about our history and our legacy, what we should talk about, that we should not be silent toward those notions. We should not just stay back. We should not stay outside of it. Those questions on the past, even if it is challenging past, they should be discussed. What is the colonial trauma about? In most of the cases, that it only gets worse if you never discuss it, if it's being silenced. So as the philosopher says, you have to work on it. You have to work on it. You have to overcome this trauma. But this trauma has brought us to what situation? That it's basically, it has created in some way our feelings culturally and mentally. It has been brought to up, the feeling of inferiority, of infantility, of childness, of the have no opportunities to create our own literature, or to have no opportunities to have our own avant-garde literature and culture. That is a depressing psychology, if we might say that. So this is something that has been brought onto us throughout centuries. So I do believe that when we are posing this question, and this question has been posed for multiple years already, and we're trying to process this experience as well, but those are challenging questions. You have mentioned in the right way that it's not about only reappropriation or fighting back, but it's also about the challenging moments of common experience and common history. This is about this, front lines and this front line cultures or cross-border cultures. So, for example, our western borders and how the western Ukraine, how Galicia and Lithuania has been the part of Poland at some point, and those really challenging relations between those borderlands. That has something that has been discussed as well. I do recall that at one of the conferences that has been dedicated to Ivan Franko, was held in Lviv, I can't recall when, but there was one researcher from Austria who said that Ivan Franko is an Austrian writer because he has been active throughout the times of Austro-Hungarian Empire. And he has said that at the opening of the Congress on Ukrainian literature. So, of course, some people have tried to oppose this position and try to explain it to him, but I do believe that this is yet another issue that has to be discussed. Yes, Ivan Franko, who has written in Germany, in German, in Polish, who has been working for German and Polish publications, who actually given his money, who kept him living because he had no other salaries in Ukraine. Those issues have to be discussed as well.
Hear you?
Oh,
now it's okay.
can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay, good. I will continue on what Tamara was saying. I think the question of Franco opens a larger box of these questions. And I think this issue of, a common legacy, common heritage, we can look at that in different ways. So there's something that the Polish intellectual and culture maker Krzysztof Cieszewski says, which is that often in our multicultural world today, we think about building bridges, going from one side of the river to the other side of the river, right? Building a bridge, or we want people to come over to our side of the river. make it possible for them to assimilate, to understand us, right? But he says, actually, we need to realize that most cities are built on both banks of the river. It's all us. And in fact, we don't exist without that other bank of the river, because then we wouldn't have the river. And that's a metaphor, but I think it's useful here to think about, what do we mean by common heritage? If we think of something as a common heritage, inherently we're implying that there is some difference there. And I wonder if that's actually precisely what we need to investigate. And I think these projects and these questions are happening in Ukraine today. I've been getting a lot of messages about Stanislav Lem and all the events that are taking place in Poland and in Ukraine and in Lviv to honor Lem. And Lem, Stanislav Lem, is from Lviv. I can't give his full bio right now, I would make mistakes, but from Lviv, lived in Lviv, left, and never came back. He would not consider himself Ukrainian in any way, and yet he's part of Ukraine's heritage and is being honored as such. And I think that kind of move to consider people like Lem part of our heritage is deeply, deeply important, right? And another example would be the recent book that came out, edited and translated by Andriy Boyarov on the group Artes, which just won a major award at the Lviv Book Forum. But it's about Artes, this interwar group of Polish, Jewish, Ukrainian artists. And the argument of that book is that this is our story, right? This is our legacy. Right? It's not separated into Polish or Jewish or Ukrainian, it's our legacy. And ultimately, I think that's a larger issue of actually getting beyond Soviet categories, right? The Soviet categories, according to Soviet nationality policy, were that culture is divided by ethnos. Culture is divided by nationality. You have Jewish stuff, you have Ukrainian stuff, you have Polish stuff, right? And I think moving beyond that is to say it's all ours, right? And that in a way is a huge move of decolonization, right? And these projects on Lem or on Artes are actually decolonizing projects, right? By saying we're creating new categories, the category of this culture of this huge space that is Ukraine, and it's huge, with all of these cultural influences, and to claim it as, quote, our own, right? I think that is a huge process of decolonization, and I think that's happening. I think that's actually happening in Ukraine today, and those projects are extremely, extremely exciting. And then to Tamara's point about Franco, I think it is on us as academics attending these conferences to speak up and say, when you say Franco is an Austrian author, what exactly do you mean? And can we unpack that comment, right? Or it's on me every time I hear the phrase Russian avant-garde, right, to speak up and say, what do you mean by Russian avant-garde, right? And to really unpack that. So thank you.
But I would like to return it again to you and just point out a few principles that you use to say that it's ours, actually. So what does it have to be? It has to be connected to the territory, land, language, place of birth, school, tradition. What exactly are those features that you relate to say that it was ours?
Це питання дуже складне.
I know that it's a very complex question, and I basically, I have to say, I don't know how you can answer that, but I do believe that all of those notions have to be considered. Depend on what situation we're talking about and what is the most important for each specific situation. Basically, we should not reinvent the wheel once again, because the wheel has already been invented. But I think considering this, we have to take a look at the experience of other countries and people as well, the one who have been through the experience of decolonization for a longer periods, because they have already tried out some of the models already, or for example, stating your identity, return of your identity, taking out of those, taking those memes and myth that have started, that has been rooted into the colonial times. I do believe that saying that we have already had some formulas created that give us the opportunity to speak about certain hybridity, like speaking about, to have this hybrid definition, like for example, Ukrainian and Russian artists, or there are some formulas as well when we have some artists or writers, for example, of Ukrainian origins, that has also been established as the one that is frequently used. I think that we can use those kind of hybrid forms as well. But what is the most important, all over the world, we should actually post the origins of each artist or writer to Ukraine. And basically, for example, for Kazimir Malevich and your book of Kiev periods, so basically, you know, saying that Kazimir Malevich has been a Ukrainian artist, that what has been something that I think that you have already been the subject of a lot of critique. Or, for example, saying that Arhipenko as a Ukrainian artist, you would have the same. And I believe that there has been a lot of things that have been done already. And I do believe that, as we have already explained it, we have all that, this restoration, the regions of a lot of artists for Ukraine. Because there is also these issues of the joint roots. We have to discuss it. We have to discuss it publicly. We have to organize the exhibitions and some kind of discussions as well. Because, well, for example, it happened that I was really interested in Rubel, who also has a very strong connection to Kiev. It's not just about the church, the Kirillov church that he has worked on. He has been treated here. He has been coming here for multiple times. That he has been connected to that. That, well, at least, you know, we have seen that Kiev period has been pointed out in some way. But why can't we organize this kind of exhibition for his Kiev period, to make it public, you know, to make it visible, to represent it to the world and emphasize and highlight that as well? I do believe that it's very important to find the best ways to show your presence to the world, actually making yourself visible to the world. And I think that that is very important as well. For example, you know, changing Kiev, not K-I-E-Y, but to Kiev, K-Y-I-V. So basically the same thing, introducing Ukrainian language audio guides, or showing on every step you take to highlight this role and importance of Ukraine as a language, as a territory, to raise this discussion. You know, this is like a Gogol's question, you know, the Gogol dilemma. Who Mykola Gogol is, whose legacy is that? The same thing about Bulgakov. So basically the same controversial but important person as well. But we have to talk about that. We cannot avoid that. I think that is very important. It is very important to raise those important questions and not to be afraid of those challenging issues.
Can you hear me? Yes. I would also say we shouldn't be afraid of difficult questions, and we shouldn't be afraid of difficult processes. I think, Tanya, your question is almost impossible to answer. But it's important to think why it's impossible to answer, right? That what do we mean? Do we mean territory, language, some sense of, Ukrainianness? What exactly do we mean? And it's a hard question because these people had such complicated senses of belonging, such complicated senses of who they were in their lives and in their work. And for us to sort of put them in these boxes, it reduces them in a sense, right? And I think, what's important is the conversation and actually the clarity, right? To say about someone like Malevich, no, he's not a Russian avant-garde artist. He was born here. He spoke these languages. He studied here. He associated with these people. What name you want to put on that, I don't know, right? Late imperial, early Soviet artist, to me, might kind of incorporate a bunch of those senses of belonging, right? The same way for like Les Kurbas, right? He was a Soviet artist. But we'd also want to specify he was born in small town in Galicia in Austria-Hungary, and he studied in Vienna, and that's very important. And he spoke all these languages, and he made theater in all these different places. You can't reduce him to one adjective, right? And I think our desire to reduce people to adjectives is a problem, actually. And I think accepting the complexity for particularly in my work on artists and on theater, right, in the imperial and post-imperial and Soviet and post-Soviet space is really important. And it might mean really long sentences in books and really long sentences in grant applications explaining someone's complicated senses of identity. But I think that's the process. The process is actually having that conversation. I don't think that writers or artists belong to one country. I don't think they belong to one person. I think they maybe transcend these borders that we're creating and that have been created in the past. And so I think the important thing is to be having that conversation and recognize that we need to be having it. I don't know that we can come up with an answer up to whom an artist belongs, because good art should transcend those borders, I think. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I know that the question doesn't have the answers, but I must ask it. Actually, I do have my own questions as a moderator, but we already have 3 questions from the audience, and I would like to give the floor to our audience. And the first questions actually reflects on what you just said, and if I may, we'll just read it in Ukrainian, asked for translation. How do we combine that common or hybrid approach, something like the Russian-Ukrainian artists, for example, with the political agenda that's based on dividing, like an example of Ukraine in relation to Russia? Yeah, so because Russia tries to grab and expand its culture to all the Ukrainian phenomena, and we really have to stand on ours here. How do we, unite those academic and political agendas?
With difficulty. I think that's a very honest answer, and I would say, as a foreign, non-Ukrainian specialist on Ukraine, I can say it's a question that I face almost every day. That there is an imperative to constantly, I think Tamara will support me on this, that Western academia is very Russia-dominated and Russia-focused. And in my classes and my work, to bring in Ukraine and kind of consistently be saying, it's not Russia, it's not the Soviet Union, it's not all Russia, is very difficult. It's difficult with students, it's difficult with colleagues. And so that is a battle that we fight. And at the same time, as a scholar of theater in the region, of course, I'm very sensitive to the Koryphei, who were artists in the Russian Empire and, spoke all these languages and can't be separated from their Russian imperial structures, right? Or this sort of sense of commonality between Ukraine and Russia. Of course, I'm very sensitive to that. And so I think, again, it's specificity can help us, being very specific about where someone's from, what they're working in the structures in which they were working, right? And being very cautious about slipping into letting Russia take over the conversation. So I think that, of course, talking about culture is always political. And of course, there's a political agenda, and one has to be aware of it, and yet one also has to acknowledge the complexity of the world in which we live. And so that's my attempt at answering a very good but very, very difficult question.
Returning the same question to Tamara, I would like her also to mention this theory of neocolonialism, that's being used in relation to what is happening today between Russia and Ukraine.
Я згоджуюся з Мей.
I would agree to Mayhill, because this is a very difficult question. But basically we cannot avoid this question as well. Well, basically, when we are talking about Bulgakov, so basically we understand that Mikhail Bulgakov is definitely a wide-known author, a wide-known writer who has done a lot to disrupt this totalitarian idea overall, or to disrupt the totalitarian system. But on the other hand, in the same time, he has been integrated into this system. So, this complexity of the position of the Soviet writer, who is ideologically engaged, who has his certain agenda, basically holding a fist in his pocket for the system, but it's basically an interesting phenomena. On the other hand, we know a different Mikhail Bulgakov, who has written the text on Ukraine, who has been in love with Kiev, and he has a tight connection to Kiev as well, but in the same way, he couldn't accept the Ukrainian national movement. So basically, he was trying to make it look like a foolish idea. So basically, we have to discuss it as well. But we have to discuss it. We cannot avoid these issues. We have to speak of how Bulgakov has influenced Ukrainian authors as well, just as Mykola Gogol as well. On one hand, Gogol has made Ukraine fashionable. He has sent out the trend for Ukraine in the Russian Empire. He has created this Malo-Russian trend of Ukraine in Russian Empire. And in some extent, as some critics have said, that he has packed Ukraine and sold it to the Russian Empire. He has shown the beauty and the sentimental beauty of Ukraine to the empire. But on the other hand, Mykola Gogol has also brought something to Russia that even the Russian critics said that was an extreme danger that Gogol has provided to the Russian culture, because language-wise, we can say that Gogol has brought a mixture of language, of Russian language, into Russian literature, and compared to language of Pushkin and his prose and his classical Russian, he has brought this devilship into the language. And everyone has said that this is the danger for the Russian culture, this devilish culture that has been brought up to Mykola Gogol, to Russian culture that disrupts Russian culture. So those are the things that are implicit, the internal things connected to the aesthetics, feelings and aesthetic directions. They sometimes also, they disrupt this external, ideological, linear reading of any kind of author or any kind of masterpiece.
And about the language. One of the issues that we have to cope with daily is the transliteration of even Ukrainian phenomena, but translated from Russian. Yeah, so you mentioned Kyiv, not Kiev, and we have many of those examples. Alexander Bogomazov or Alexander Bogomazov, Alexander Exter or Alexander Exter, yeah, and so on and so forth. Is there a concept that transliteration rules are fixed and cannot be changed, or is there some kind of way to influence that and actually suggest Ukrainian transliteration to the Ukrainian names and phenomena?
So I face this question in my work all the time, right? And I think the best practice is to use the transliteration today, right? Alexandra Exter, and then put in parentheses Alexandra Exter, as she's known in English, simply not for political reasons, but simply because you want your readers to be able to find her elsewhere in sources, right? How did someone write their own name versus how might we transliterate it today? So again, I'm all for making text more complicated, right? I'm all for putting things in parentheses and being really, really clear, right, about how we are naming things and whether we're naming someone or something as it would not have been named then. I think clarity and adding text is right now the best solution. And I also think continually to push for Kyiv versus Kiev, right? And a lot of that is on, again, people in the Western press and people in the Western media and Western academics to continue respecting that. It is also a project, I would say, of the Ukrainian Institute to continue supporting academic programs, to support translation, to support projects that continue to promote Ukraine and Ukrainian, and Ukraine is the center of its own story, abroad, right? It's that kind of education that will trickle down, right, to people, so that, maybe one day one of my students will actually spell Kiev correctly, and not from the Russian transliteration. So I would say more words and more education.
Thank you. We actually have another question that I think could be used to sum up the conversation, because it relates actually to the issue of methodology. And one of our audience is asking on what are the reasons for us to use the term post-colonialism to the Ukrainian culture, because the term itself has emerged in totally different contexts towards different countries. And other research on this issue, in particular related to Ukraine. And I would add to this question that oftentimes that post-colonial theory is not applied to Russia and Ukraine because of this reason. So, yeah, Tamara, could you answer?
Well, yes, of course, that is also the question of methodology you apply, and it has been discussed for a longer period of time, and there are different positions on that. But speaking in a deeper sense, that is about of whether Russia has been an empire, whether we can call the Soviet Union an empire, and so on and so forth. But we can actually say that when all of this strategy of how you treat the people, and this concept of this friendship of people, the Soviet friendship of people, it has still been built in a framework of some certain colonization, because you had the central people, the central nation as Russia, this older brother so-called, and those younger brothers or sisters that are the other nations and ethnicities. So this is an open question for discussion, and still we have some pros and cons to that. What I wanted to outline as well would be that the main question of post-colonialism, as that is a whole trend, this whole direction that has been built on the book of Edward Said on Orientalism. It has been basically issuing with a question of basically changing the power between object and subject. So actually making Ukraine as an observational object, as an object that you can manipulate, control, that you can apply pressure to. So this is the question of being an object or a subject in your own relations. This is a question of power as well that has to be considered by post-colonialism as well. I also wanted to mention this post-colonial novel by Yuri Andrukhovich, The Moscoviat, which is basically a beautiful novel when the colonial subject, the colonial subject from Ukraine, from Halichina, the one who goes to Moscow, he goes to Moscow as to metropolis, as to a center, and he goes to the metropolis that is now dying off. The novel has been written, I guess, in 1996, but this story of his trip, of his journey, from this person who has been from the province to the metropolis that is dying, that is declining, this feeling of, laughter, grotesque torture, grotesque violence towards this empire, and maybe some kind of, sympathy to that dying of empire. This is a good example of this post-colonial mind frame that takes this big concept of center and the periphery. And what Mayhill has said, it's now turns it upside down. This person from a province, he feels himself in Moscow not as a person with different kind of self-confidence issues, but he believes himself to be the subject of the action. He comes to the metropolis, to the center of the metropolis, and he feels himself free to do whatever he wants. He wants to play with irony. He can behave himself in a different way he wants. So basically, the post-colonial methodology is a very interesting lens as well, and it's very useful for us as well. And decolonization, and basically it still has different notions and still have different ways of working in that. For example, a very important experience of Latin American countries, and Walter Mignon, who uses the decolonization notion for the Latin American countries. There's an interesting experience because he speaks about this decolonization that is at the same time combined to this understanding that you cannot step aside this colonial artifact artifacts and colonial signs. And this is also an importance of the different ways of culture that goes through language, gestures, dance, other types of these rituals even. So it's all ingrained in that. And it's really hard to impact on that, for example, it's harder to impact than impact on language. It have been preserved among the people, and it's actually the one that opposes the colonization as well.
Up having this conversation, but the time is off, and I just want to apply to Mykola Ryabchuk's words, saying that it would be naive to think that post-colonial approach will explain all Ukrainian problems, but we definitely have to address and discuss that. Thank you.